what is science and can we trust it?
Science is the determined effort to get the facts straight on factual matters, and especially general facts. So let's go back to primitive society before history. Important scientific discovery was that babies are caused by sex 9 months earlier. That's not obvious. Yeah, it takes a lot of thinking about. You've got to check the evidence. You've got to look at virgins and see that they're not having children. Then you've got to work back a bit from the fact that people are pregnant for a while. Well, it's not easy, but it's this kind of general truth, scientific truth about matters of fact that you can get to if you're careful. You might have to experiment a little, probably not allowed under present ethics guidelines, but I suppose in the old days they could do what they liked. And modern science is the same. And if the evidence is good, if you've checked the theory against the facts and checked it against new facts, checked its predictions, well, you can rely on it. But science, the word science means a couple of different things. It means the actual theories with the evidence for them, but then it means science, the industry or sociological construct or something, the actual scientists. And yeah, you can't quite always trust them.
It's a bold statement, if I may make the observation. Now, I'll make a bit of a kind of comment to assist structure our conversation. Personally, I trust the scientific method in so much as I understand it. I'm not scientifically trained. But as you've kind of articulated there, I have a distrust of some practitioners. And it's not because I think that they're corrupt. I think that actual corruption and actual falsifying of data would be phenomenally rare. I have a high degree of trust for practitioners of science. That being said, I think human desires such as ideology, self-image, the desire for status, the desire for money, really does impact on practitioners of science in just as much as a disinterested pursuit of science. Even going back as far really as Galileo and the church. Now that's always framed as mindless religion, or mindless ideological religion versus brave scientific inquiry. But that's not exactly what happened with Galileo, really. It really is, and I don't want to go specifically into the climate change debate, but what happened with Galileo and the church really does remind me of that debate, because you had a scientific consensus, a chap challenging the scientific consensus, and he was kind of like said, well, no, you just don't know as much as the consensus. So for Galileo and the church, it really wasn't about science versus religion per se.
Well, some of it was, some of it wasn't. It's true that the church was relying on the consensus of physicists, astronomers at that time, who were Jesuits and so on. It was true, though, that there was an element of science versus religion in it. Galileo turned out, surprisingly, to be quite good at theology. I mean, his interpretations of what the Bible said turned out on modern theological understandings to be better than the ones of the church. He interpreted the earth, the sun stands still metaphorically, and he was right. But it's quite true, to go back to the main game, that scientists are subject to some pressures like status and so on that sometimes lead them astray. Now, it's harder for scientists to be led astray than it is for, say, astrologers or theologians or something, because they do have to lay out their evidence in refereed scientific papers, and in principle, you can go and check. But the pressures on them are actually, in many cases, a lot simpler than what you say about status, money, and ideology. What a scientist has to do is stay employed as a scientist, and successfully so. Now, most science, especially expensive science, is done on soft money, meaning renewable grants. You must get the grant renewed, and to do that, you must have published great stuff in the last 3 years. Your team, as well as yourself, knows that their continued employment depends on the results. They know what results they have to get, and they don't necessarily fake them, but they well, there's matters of interpretation that did the subject really recognize the letter A in the picture? Well, it's hard to say. Well, let's say they did, because, you know, we got that's the result that the the data gatherer knows that the research leader needs to get. Well, there's that kind of pressure that it's very hard to evaluate. Let me mention actually a famous retraction of a few months ago, which I think gives some insight into this, about just looking it up by in social psychology, which is one of the flakiest areas for retractions. In a 2012 paper, the topic was whether signing an honesty declaration at the beginning of a form rather than the end made people filling in the form less likely to lie. It's kind of intuitively sort of likely that they would. Well, in the 2012 paper found they did. People found they couldn't reproduce that, and some data experts went and found that the data it was based on was statistically impossible. So the lead author said, well, something has gone wrong. It wasn't my data. And all the co-authors said, well, nothing to do with me. We just trusted the data that came in. And the data can't be found. It was from some insurance country. Well, it's not good. That's not how science should be done. Yeah. And obviously some pressure to get results that somebody wanted has caused that. Now, how common that is, of course, it's hard to say, but there's a whole website out there called Retraction Watch. It's one of the world's fantastic websites and shows you where it's going wrong. And the proportion of things going wrong gets worse and worse as you go along. Now, I do trust lots of kinds of science where this doesn't much happen. Solid state physics, it's great. Number theory, it's great. You can, I think there's nothing wrong in there. But some other things, well, they don't. Yeah, that's it, Retraction Watch, tracking retractions as they happen. And you can follow, yeah, I recommend that to your readers, listeners. They'll have hours of enjoyment looking at the flaky things that have been found in science. Now, they shouldn't conclude from that science is all rubbish, but they should conclude that the scientific method is not quite all it's cracked up to be.
We've got to realise the historical context of where science comes out from too, really. It was one of the things that helped us end those almost endless religious civil wars that were happening in Europe. You know, people wanted to be able to, because Christianity at its heart makes a claim to truth. It's not like other religions in that, where it's just a school that are, you know, and this is a very broad overbrush, I can see, that really are transactional, where you're kind of trying to ask something out of reality, especially the pagan religions I'm talking about there, the ones that preceded religions. I wouldn't. It was a massive leap forward to have a religion that made a claim to truth. But then, of course, you know, the logical consequence of a religion that makes a claim to truth is all these people kind of breaking out and saying, well, you know, my truth, which is, again, it's actually playing out in the world again today.
Yeah.
So what we needed was a mechanism to be able to say, well, whose truth is the truth. Everyone was a Pontius Pilate, really, when it came.
Yeah, that's right. So science is very good like that, as you say, from the 17th century, as a training in recognizing that you could get to the truth. There's a great passage in Galileo, and I'm a great admirer of Galileo, that says that if the question of how the heavens went was a humanistic or legal question, like, a humanistic or legal question, the argument about it could go on till kingdom come. But science can actually get the evidence and settle something. And they did settle that, in fact, the earth went round the sun and not the sun went round the earth. And everybody was surprised by that, partly because there hadn't been that kind of progress in science in actually determining the facts.
I suppose another good way of framing a conversation around that would be, can science give us the full story of how the universe is? And by that, to give a discussion point, my understanding is, and I'm seeking correction here, is that science tells us that there's material stuff. And fundamentally, we're kind of animals that are just a bit smarter than the rest. And to suggest anything else is kind of unscientific. So can we kind of, is that first, is that do I have an accurate understanding of what science is and the claims it makes? And then can we lead on to what does science know and what doesn't it know?
Yeah, no, it's not correct in that the argument that science discovers material stuff is true, but the idea that that it discovers there's only material stuff is not true, and it can't be true, because science confines itself to certain kinds of questions and certain kinds of evidence. Observations, publicly accessible observations, and summaries of those in experiments. Now, if there were gods or minds other than brains, minds that were kind of separable from brains, as Descartes thought, then science couldn't determine that one way or the other. It's just not the kind of thing it can do. So take a comparison. If science confined itself to visual evidence, measurements of what you could see out there, then they wouldn't have discovered that there's such a thing as sound. But it doesn't follow from that there's no such thing as sound. It's just there's some other reason for thinking there are sounds, namely that you hear them. Mm. Science doesn't attempt the kind of questions, evaluative or ethical ones. So there's a fair question: is Shakespeare the greatest English dramatist? Well, there are reasons for that or not, but it makes no sense to look for scientific evidence for it. Science just doesn't address that kind of thing, and the evidence that science looks at doesn't bear on it. And in fact, the same is true of all philosophical arguments. So you go and hear philosophers, so is the mind reducible to the brain or not? Well, that's a philosophical question. Science might bear on it marginally, but the fact that you cut up a brain and don't find a thought in there, or a soul or something, it just doesn't tell you that there's no such things as thoughts or minds. It's just the wrong instrument to do that kind of thing. So to do philosophical questions like, are there minds or other than brains, or is ethics objective, or what about literary criticism, what's good and bad? They're questions that could have wrong and right answers, but science can't answer them. So the argument that science shows there's material things, so that science shows there's only material things, is a philosophical argument, not a scientific argument, and it's a bad one.
Gotcha. And I think one of the other misunderstandings people like me have, again, not being scientifically trained, is, and I had this discussion defending science vehemently, and even I saw the shortcoming of this person's argument. We had a discussion about the nature of observation, which is what I think you were talking about before when it comes to, sound. So when we say observation, of course, being basically visual creatures, we kind of think, oh, well, you've got to see it. But observation, especially when you're dealing with, physics and when you're dealing at a very, very, very small level, observation isn't exactly what we think it is. And I know this is stringing something onto you, but can we discuss the nature of what a scientist means when they say observation?
Right. Well, I have to say I'm not an experimental scientist, so I might talk rubbish about this. I'm a simple philosopher and mathematician, so I haven't even cleaned bottles in a lab. But it's fair to say that scientists prefer something visual on a scale. They love to be able to measure a length on a recording instrument. And failing that, they love to be able to count something, so that in social psychology, you count how many people think such and such. And after they've been exposed to the video or something, how many of them think something or other. So that's observation, can be a little flaky, but I think that's where it was regarded as central to observation. You can have purely sound observations, but scientists don't like them. They really like to have an audiograph, where the sound is translated to something that they can measure visually on an actual scale.
I find that fascinating, and it is kind of linked back to your discussion as to the limitations of science. One of the other things that having massive debates about today, and it's of course related to really important subjects like artificial intelligence, is what's the nature of consciousness? Now, it's hard enough to define it, let alone find a way to measure it.
That's right. So consciousness is one of the things that have been very difficult for the theory that science tells you everything. And it's kind of become agreed among philosophers that there is a hard problem of consciousness. Not all of them think that, but most of them think when you've done all the scientific things like cut up the brain and looked at the correlations of this and that, correlations of brain waves and decisions or something, the actual feeling of consciousness is left over. So this is really one of the developments in the picture of science that I've seen in my lifetime. There was in the 1950s when I was born, there was a very there was a feeling that science was about to crack all problems. It was very strong. They had an atom bomb. They just discovered the double helix DNA. They promised that in 5 years there'd be artificial intelligence as good as humans. They said we're going to grow life in a test tube, blah, blah. And now since then, most of the money spent on science has been spent since then. And those promises have got completely bogged down. And especially artificial intelligence has done wonderful things, but it's also shown us what we don't know. You can see it if you use Google Translate to try and translate one of the two major languages, let's say German to English. You're going on fine, you put in the German, you read the English, and it's making it all complete sense. And suddenly it does something that a human couldn't do. It's complete rubbish. And you realize, look, there's no one in there understanding what the original text said. It's understanding with a consciousness that is being left out of what artificial intelligence and any mechanical thing like that can do. And the more we've understood and had success with artificial intelligence, the more we understand that it's getting absolutely nowhere. It's not even at square one or having a plan on how to do actual understanding.
But it's kind of linked with another conceptual framework that's really, really important in society today. Can we just follow the science? Because I hold that there's a value statement, a value axiom behind every scientific endeavor. So I don't think, and again, I'm seeking correction, I don't think you can just follow the science. So by way of example, we discover that you can split the atom and it releases enormous amounts of energy. Fine. That's a material scientific finding. What are we going to do with that? Becomes a kind of like, becomes another question. And even why we were seeking to split the atom in the first place, like it was more than just innate curiosity. There were certain value statements behind that firstly, it's a valuable thing to do. So, you know, I suppose that is a certain degree of curiosity, but curiosity is a good thing in itself. And then it kind of goes back to the idea that we're understanding the structure of reality and that we can use these things to help, that we can help us. But all of these things really have at the heart the idea that human life and us getting better and us progressing, however you define progress, is an important thing in and of itself. That's a value axiom. Have I explained that correctly?
That's right, that's correctly. And you're quite right that science can't tell you that that's a good value. Scientists, you've got to admire their passion for getting to the truth. Yeah, they spend, you know, someone like Rutherford or Marie Curie, they were really passionate. They're much more passionate than you and I are going to be about anything, I think, to actually really make progress and find out the truth. And that is they're right that it's a perfection of humanity, as Aristotle said, to be rational and to become educated and to learn more. It's a fantastic thing to discover something that was hidden up to now, and that you were the one that cracked through and broke the code and advanced humanity. And then, like you say, there are ethical issues about how you're going to use the results. And is an atom bomb in the circumstances a good thing or a bad thing? And those are value questions. Well, I don't like the word values, it's too subjectivist. They're ethical questions, yeah. And there's right and wrong things about those. And science itself can't answer them, and it can't really get anywhere with them. They're just the wrong kind of things for a scientific answer to appear to.
I'll make this statement. I'll get you to talk about it. I don't think it's any coincidence that science, as we know it, involved in a Judeo-Christian civilization. In fact, I don't think it could have evolved in any other contextual framework, because it relied on the idea that there was a supreme being that created a logical universe that you can understand, and that we can kind of unravel that to get an insight into the mind of the creator. And that really, from my limited understanding of the history of science, is what this OCD like really. And when you talk about those brilliant scientists, they had OCD.
Crazy.
They were genuinely crazy. Like, and we mean that. And I know, I'm sure the listeners will understand. We mean that in a totally respectful way. But those people were nuts.
Yeah, that's right.
They dedicated their every waking moment lives to understanding this little bit of the universe. But again, there's an axiom, there's an understanding, there's a conceptual framework behind that. So could science, as we know it, have evolved outside of a Judeo-Christian conceptual framework?
We're not sure. The scientific revolution, I think, fits your thesis. The scientific revolution, people like Galileo and Descartes and Pascal, they did have that perspective that the world was made by God and knowable, and they were inspired by their Christianity. However, you've got to remember that there was ancient Greek science as well, which is successful. It didn't continue as successfully to the present day, but it was genuine science, and there was a kind of scientific revolution in ancient Greece. And Aristotle, who did a lot of experimental biology, it's incredible. Half of his works is experimental biology about mollusks and things like that. He was a true OCD scientist, as well as being a philosopher on top of it. Don't know how he got the time to do any of that. And his perspective is, well, it's not Judeo-Christian. On the other hand, it resembles it. And there's a reason why Aquinas and other people in the Judeo-Christian thought leaders were keen to take on Aristotle, because he has a perspective that has a kind of abstract divinity, like as Plato does, that has a view that the world is ordered and knowable. So maybe I have some sympathy with the view of Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg speech that there was almost a Greek aspect of revelation. The Greek and Hebrew synthesis was necessary to produce what happened later. And that the Hebrew thing is great on what it does, but the more scientific aspect of things, the knowability of the universe, is heavily Greek. And those things merged to create what we now call Judeo-Christian thinking or civilization. Perhaps we should just call it Judeo-Christian Greek civilization.
Yeah, maybe we do need to add another qualifying adjective to that. You talk about Aristotle, you can't not talk about Plato. Now, when I talk about abstractions to my atheist friends, especially the ones that aren't particularly well educated, I've got to say, the unfortunate reality is I would say commonplace atheism or humanism that's pretty, most people define themselves as atheist or at best agnostic. And they frame their thinking around the new atheists, around Dawkins. And I talk to them about numbers, which is your area, when people kind of go, well, you can't prove God. Anything that you can't prove through this method it's ridiculous to even believe in it. You may as well believe in fairies down in the garden. And of course, the first question I ask is, okay, well, show me 5.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. There's many things that are not strictly observable that there's good evidence for. Now, I wouldn't say myself that numbers are a Platonist reality, but it's fair to say that there's a whole world of absolutely objective facts about a world that is not material, and there's logic, for example. The science relies very much on the bearing of experimental evidence on theory. so that if a theory is confirmed by the evidence, that's good news for the theory. Now, what kind of fact is that? Well, it's a logical fact. It's about how one proposition bears on another. And the whole word of logical facts and mathematical facts is somehow disjoint from science. And if you just look at science and think it's about material stuff and force fields and that sort of thing, you're right, that sort of thing is left over, and you have to give some kind of account of that. So yeah, that's right. And Plato was right to say that he required that a training in mathematics was necessary in your 20s before you went on to do important things like running the state. Well, yeah, maybe we should bring that idea back. Keep people quiet with some, recognize some eternal truths in mathematics, ethics, and so on, before we let them loose on deciding COVID restrictions or something.
Yes, indeed, indeed, Professor. That's certainly the case. But look, I'm going to get you to come. I'm going to put you right on the spot here. Are numbers real?
Well, they are, yeah, but they're not real in the sense of existing in a Platonic non-material realm. They are realized in this world, which is an Aristotelian realist theory, of which I hope let me advertise my book called an Aristotelian Realist Philosophy of Mathematics. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It says that numbers are real, but as relations between heaps of stuff in the world and ways of dividing the world up. So what is it to have a heap of 4 parrots? Well, there's biomass out there. And then there's the fact that being a parrot divides that into a certain number of parrots. So 4, I mean, it's hard to give a story that sounds colourful about it, but 4 is the relation between the heap of stuff, feathers and beaks and so on, and being a parrot. There's only, given what being a parrot is, what being a parrot means, there's a fixed number of them in that. And there's the same number in that number repeats itself across other things like horsemen of the apocalypse or something, or number of hours in the day. You can divide, given what an hour is and given what a day is, there's a fixed relation between the two, namely 24. So in that sense, numbers are real as relations between wholes and kinds of parts.
And see, that's it. Like, really, as you pointed out, we can't, without these, because when I discuss this with people, even like surprisingly well-educated people, like people who've got degrees, and I haven't got one, but like, you know,
I wouldn't be too intimidated by people having degrees at this stage, but anyway.
Well, I mean, when I speak to people about that, I go, well, look, you know, no one can point to 5. You know, when I kind of say, show me 5, that, you know, some people hold up 5 fingers and go, no, that's 5 fingers. And, you know, I do that. The smarter ones then write, especially when I'm at schools doing it, they'll write the symbolic representation, the Hindu Arabic.
No, that's a numeral, not a number.
Yeah. Numeral, sorry, the numeral on the...
that is right, yeah.
Yeah.
They're mistaking a numeral for a number. That's mistaking the name of something for the thing itself.
Indeed.
It's one of the oldest philosophical mistakes on earth.
Yeah, and that's it. But then on kind of, I say to them, well, you can't show me 5, can you? And they're like, no, I can't. You know, you can show you the symbol, you can show me the representation, you can show me 5 somethings, but you can't show me 5. And yet, if you lived in a world where you didn't believe, if you lived in a world that there was no 5, you wouldn't be an incredibly sane person working on complete and utter rationality. You'd be a mad person.
That's right. That's right. Being numerical is crucial to being rational. Yeah. So what you've got to explain is what 5 fingers has in common with 5 notes of music. So it's the commonality or some kind of relation that's in common that is genuine, and that number theory and mathematics studies. Yeah, you should demand people give a story about that.
Exactly right. I suppose we're leading into are science and religion, and we'll talk specifically about the Judeo-Christian conceptualizations of religion. And I know that excludes a lot. I know that excludes Islam, which is Abrahamic, and all of the pagan religions. But are those two conceptual frameworks irreconcilable opposites?
No, they're essentially talking about different things. If there's a God, then science is not going to find that God. It's just the wrong kind of thing. And likewise, science is not going to observe the number 5 because it's the wrong kind of thing. It's mathematics is there to study that kind of thing. So there have to be philosophical arguments to say why you should believe in a God, and there have to be arguments if somebody says there's some revelation is correct, say the New Testament, there has to be evidence of the appropriate kind that that's true or not. So there's some historical evidence, and that there's also, I would say, ethical evidence, and that you get the picture that Jesus' ethical picture of humans fits what you think antecedently about humans. Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. That's for you to evaluate. But there's various arguments like that are appropriate to consider, and they just don't have any relation to science. And so science, a religion is not going to say that there's anything wrong with any scientifically established truth, but they're going to say that the nature of its evidence and methods is not going to bear on questions like ethics or the existence of God.
Yeah, exactly. And look, I think where people, I kind of understand a little bit of the idea of well, I think I do anyway, the postmodernist idea that there's no such thing as objectivity. And it's because we have this kind of like, we've broken up these conceptual frameworks, and we're making some claims of objectivity in science, which can be easily proved. But then we claim objectively moral, we claim truths, some truths, moral truths are objectively, they're objective as well. And then you get, good, I suppose when I say good, I mean intellectually strong philosophers like, Foucault and Derrida kind of saying, well, actually, there's no such thing as objectivity. So I'd like your take on whether or not there is such a thing as objectivity, and the strength of the postmodernist argument.
Yeah, well, one of the good things about science is that it's taken no notice of postmodernism. So science is full of objectivity, and you can just go and see it. And if the postmodernists say, well, there isn't objectivity, well, don't tell me, show me. I mean, you can go and look at the evidence that for let's say, the circulation of the blood, that's a very old established scientific truth. Of course, it's objective. And if the postmodernists or someone says it's not, well, the only answer to that is here's the evidence. Go and look at the scans. You can see the blood beating, and you can see the blood going around. That's all there is to it. Now, having said that, objectivity, there needs to be an account of what objectivity is. So normally what we should be defending, I think, is the objectivity of the relation between evidence and hypothesis. So given a theory or possible theory, there's evidence that bears on it, either positively or negative, and you've got to go and look at it. And that's not just true of scientific theories, it's true in a court of law. So is Cardinal Pell guilty? Well, the evidence is before the jury, and they get it all wrong. And the High Court has to tell them that you couldn't have reached a guilty verdict on the evidence that was before you. So that is a defence by the High Court of the objectivity of evidence. And I think it's obvious to everybody really that there is such a thing as that, and that if they are in a jury, it's their business to believe in the objectivity of evidence and see if the evidence before them makes the guilty of the accused proved beyond reasonable doubt or not.
So what is the nature, when it comes right down to it, of evidence? Can we kind of discuss that, like at a really deep philosophical level?
Well,
and I'm sorry to do this to
you. Probability. I agree with the position of Keynes, the economist Keynes, but before he did an easy topic like economy, he tried to write down the nature of evidence in his 1921 book, Treatise on Probability. And his theory is that it's logic and that it's a kind of partial implication. So what full implication means is, in the old example of the syllogism, that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a watertight argument. If two premises are true, the conclusion must be true. But what about 99% of men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal? Or something like the vast majority of flights land safely, therefore I can be relaxed on takeoff. So it's not watertight, but nevertheless, the great majority of the things being a certain way is good evidence. It's very, very good reason to believe the conclusion. So that's the kind of thing evidence is. It's something like implication, perfect logical implication, like you get in proof in mathematics, only partial.
Gotcha. Okay. I think I understand that. And it's something as you can tell from the discussion I've had with you, obviously, I haven't got a degree and I'm not university trained, but I genuinely find these topics fascinating, because it comes right down to what is the nature of real things. And again, when I was in the police, like I jailed a number of people for considerable amounts of time. Actually, there's more than one or two people who had like about a fifth of their life taken away because of, well, it wasn't because of me, actually, it was because of the things they did. But, I facilitated that to happen. And I used to ask myself the moral questions as to whether or not it was all worth it. And I'd even start asking myself, of course, discussing it with defense lawyers, who aren't, no matter what everyone says, aren't all bad people. They're genuinely concerned about, and I say that as an ex-policeman, they're genuinely concerned about justice and truth and the nature of reality and stuff too. But, having these discussions, it was really kind of...
That's as good a background as anything else on how to evaluate evidence if you've got to put some away for years. Were you convinced on the evidence that those people you put away were guilty of the crimes?
Yeah, there was only... I shouldn't reveal too much, actually, because although I'm not subject to discipline anymore, there was only, and it was after the fact, there was only one chap that was found guilty, and he didn't do any time. It was for a relatively minor charge of a break-and-enter, and he made full confessions in an interview that I discovered later on through investigating another matter through some other break-and-enters, that he was involved in the break, but not to the degree that he said he was, and he was taking responsibility for some of his friends to protect them. So he ended up taking some hits. He said, basically, fundamentally, this chap said that he did the entire job himself, and the other guys were acting as parties to the offence, accessories, so they would like watch, keep him watching all that kind of stuff, and that's not true. There was two or three chaps that were in there with him, but the matter had already gone through court.
That's kind of interesting. I mean, it's been Western law has had a history of giving I think an excessively high value to confessions, but actually the number of false confessions is unfortunately not near zero. That's
I'm sorry, it's higher than people would suspect, but it's not as high as some of the pundits on the media and stuff.
Right. Yeah. Anybody who's listened to that's well up to speed on the rationality of Western's thinking, I can tell you.
Well, see, that's what we've got to do, because there are serious questions now. Like I've been in discussions with high-ranking bureaucrats, people who are decision makers, who, when we even start talking about evidence, reason, logic, people just get dismissive and wave their hands away. Go, well, these are white constructs.
Yeah, that's you can't do that. The evidence is a certain way, and if you dismiss it, then you're doing it for some ideological reason that you shouldn't.
Exactly, but by the same token, to give the devil his due and to steel man an argument, there's a degree of truth to it. It's like, well, yes, we did well. When I say we, I mean Western civilization, which includes a lot more than white people, incidentally, but Western civilization is the one that I'm not going to say, we created or discovered all of those things, because that's not true. Like, numerals that we used were stolen from from the Hindus and the Arabs. And, you know, we were the ones that kind of like brought all these things together, synthesized them and purified them to make to paraphrase Churchill, you know, the least worst civilization that's existed ever. You know, it's a terrible civilization. You know, Western civilization as it speaks now is terrible. It's full of faults. It's got all the injustices. But it is still, of course, superior to everything that has existed in the past or exists.
Yeah, that's right. And in particular, understanding the relation of evidence is mostly done in Western thinking, not exclusively, but especially in Western legal thinking. The law was very good at moving these things forward, because the thing about law is that it has to decide what comes in over the fence, so to speak. And there's typically evidence for and against guilt or ownership or whatever it might be. And law has had to be very explicit about how to evaluate evidence for and against conclusions. They did it well before science got into it. And that's a fascinating story. And mostly, as it happens, a Western story. But then it's like other things, it's a gift of the Western civilization to everybody else, like health things, and everybody should take it on board, since that was what was discovered.
Yeah, I get really, really nervous when I hear people, and again, who are relatively high level, like I'm talking executive level bureaucrats, just wave their hand and say, it's a Western construct. We're actually, and they frame the conversation around a transcendence. So it's this dismissive, you know, it's really dismissive, condescension, but then trying to frame the idea that it's transcendent to go beyond, to go beyond that.
What go beyond? Yeah, we're transcending to where? Yeah, I'm reminded of the old saying that if you're against logic, it's probably because logic is against you.
Yeah. I wasn't a negotiator in the police, but I did quite a few negotiations. And sometimes you work together. So you'll have like a couple of people and you'll bounce stuff off each other when you're talking on the phone, or even sometimes shouting through the megaphone or whatever it is that you're doing. And one of my colleagues said to me, oh, well, you know, promise this guy, Matt, that he's going to get a fair trial when he comes out. And I've looked at my colleague and gone, that's precisely what he fears. He fears a fair trial. What he wants to do is distort the trial to get the outcome that he wants. So I see where you're coming from. Sounds good, but it's a no from me. The funny thing is, there is a real hunger. I can tell you, Professor, there's a real hunger for this sort of knowledge out there. Now, if you had have said to me a couple of years ago, Maloney, start off a podcast, it's going to be really primitive. You're going to be sitting in your study where you haven't even got like good blockers of the light outside. You know, people are going to see your really untidy bookshelf, which is indicative of just how untidy your mind is. And people are going to be genuinely interested in conversations with a philosopher and a discussion about the nature of rationality and the nature of evidence. People would have sniggered, but let me tell you, there's a real hunger.